Defending against malicious USB firmware with good USB, presented by Marc Moore. Like the floppy disk before it, USB drives are a common delivery mechanism for malware. Viruses, rootkits, etc. can be installed when a USB drive from an unknown source is inserted into an unprotected computer. And as with earlier iterations of the removable device delivery vector, even casual computer users are now aware of this threat. Most immediate and advanced users know not to install a foreign USB drive into their computer. In addition, virus and malware software is commonly implemented to address this problem. Some institutions even provide public kiosks to scan such devices for malware. In response, malware developers have created a new threat vector that targets the USB stack itself at a lower level than host-side attacks. The USB protocol allows a device to register as multiple device types. In itself, this is not a problem. Consider a USB keyboard with a built-in trackpad as a common legitimate example of this use case. Unfortunately, when malware is embedded in a USB device's firmware, the USB enumeration phase allows the device to load any number of drivers, whether appropriate or not. And because the firmware is running in the context of the USB stack, anti-malware software cannot defend against it. This combination gives the malware the potential to gain inappropriate access to unrestricted device privileges, and it's important to recognize that any type of corrupted USB device can be a threat. It's not just USB thumb drives that we have to guard against. Let's look at a simple example. Many of us have computers with a USB webcam attached. Consider the potential for a bad actor to install malicious firmware on the camera. It has been done before, as more than one hardware vendor has learned the hard way. A webcam has no need to access a USB keyboard driver. However, the USB protocol does not prohibit the action, as multiple driver requests are normal for some devices. By default, the request would be granted, giving the camera's firmware the opportunity to inject keystrokes, potentially whole commands or scripts, into the host machine. In this way, the potential exists for the attacking code to gain access even at the root level, and/or run arbitrary code. Users are often the source of USB-generated threats to a computing system. They will, despite the best advice of their security advisors, plug in a foreign device into an unsecured computer with no more thought than buying a cup of coffee. This is a known fact. The corollary is that even a sophisticated user can fall victim to a firmware-based threat. After all, their shiny new keyboard was just scanned by the IT department's anti-malware software. But plugging a device with infected firmware into a host can have disastrous effects, as we've seen. Enter the user as the last line of defense against this threat. The USB stack has no way of knowing what access the new device truly needs, but the user knows. A webcam does not need keyboard access. If asked properly, many users would recognize this anomaly and stop the threat themselves. The authors of this paper, Dave Tion, Adam Bates, and Kevin Butler, implemented an experimental addition to the USB stack to improve host security. The most important feature in their good USB implementation is user permission mediation. Before a USB device is granted access to a device driver, the access must be approved by the user. A second novel feature of good USB is that access requests that users reject are routed to a virtual honeypot for examination. Aside from user interaction, the good USB implementation is fast. It imposes only a 5% decrease in performance. As shown, a USB device that requests access to a driver has that request mediated by good USB. Good USB ensures that, before a USB device is granted access to a device driver, the access is approved by the user. This is similar to Android app permissions, in which an app must declare its permission requirements and have them approved by the device user. In short, the user of the host computer becomes the policy filter through which requests for USB permissions must pass. To help users perform the device mediation function, a database of known device identifiers is maintained. When a device previously inserted into the host is plugged in again and requests the same access as before, the user has only to confirm the access to allow it. Similarly, if a known device requests the same access as before and the user rejects the request, the device and driver combination is flagged as suspicious. Finally, if a known device requests different access, the user can confirm the new driver request or reject it. Rejecting the changed access request will also flag this device and driver combination as suspicious. If a USB device is flagged as suspicious, its access is not rejected outright. Suspicious USB devices are connected to good USB's virtual honeypot and allowed to continue operation. Within the honeypot, the USB's device driver request is granted and its activity monitored and logged. All communications, including all keystrokes and IP packets, are logged. Good USB does not attempt threat analysis itself. Instead, the device activity logs can be directed to forensic tools such as intrusion detection systems. It's worth noting that analysis may result in a device improperly flagged as malicious being approved for use. In this case, the good USB device driver on the host must be remediated. Now that we've discussed what good USB does, let's dive into the implementation, starting with the architecture. The good USB daemon is a Linux implementation, sorry Windows users, that runs in a user thread. The policy engine, device database, and user interface all operate in the user space process shown in the diagram. The daemon communicates over a netlink socket to the good USB limited human interface device driver and the device class identifier. The good USB honeypot is a separate Linux virtual machine. We will discuss the honeypot virtual machine and the kernel editions in more detail later. Let's explore the architecture starting with the user daemon. The good USB user mode daemon is implemented in terms of three subsystems: the policy engine, the device database, and the user interface. Let's start the discussion of the daemon with the policy engine. The policy engine is the process controller, in effect, and oversees the act of determining whether a new USB device meets the user's expectations or not. If not, the policy engine enforces the rejection of the access request. Rejected requests may be blocked or redirected to the honeypot virtual machine for analysis. To collect user input about a device's access request, the policy engine invokes the user interface to obtain the user's decision about the access request. To facilitate user decision-making, the policy engine classifies devices into 17 categories, which limit the access certain types of devices can request. For instance, a storage device is not allowed to request the human interface device driver. Similarly, some USB devices such as a USB headset do require the human interface device driver with limited access. Good USB's limited HID driver is provided to support this use case. The good USB device database records device identification data produced by the kernel component, which we'll discuss later. This hashed identification data is linked to the device driver access approved by the user. For visual identification, the device identification data is also linked to a user-selected security picture. Significantly, the device data is persisted between reboots and is injected into the kernel at boot time via the netlink socket. If needed, the user can clear the device database and start fresh. The good USB user interface is controlled by the policy engine. The policy engine can be configured to run in basic and advanced driver selection modes. In basic mode, the user is prompted to validate new device access by choosing a class of device. Conversely, in advanced mode, the user chooses the exact individual drivers to allow the device to access. Thus, when a USB device is inserted into the host computer, the user is put in control over what resources it can access. USB device insertion triggers a search of the good USB device database. When the good USB policy engine does not recognize a device, the user interface prompts the user to select the driver classes or exact drivers the device can access. The user will choose a security image for the new device at this time. If the device is recognized, the user is prompted to accept or reject the device, using the device's security image as a visual cue. If the USB device is rejected, it is flagged as potentially malicious and routed to the honeypot virtual machine for analysis. In addition to the user mode daemon, good USB makes two additions to the Linux runtime kernel: a limited human interface device driver and a device class identifier used by the policy engine to classify USB devices. These are good USB's only introductions to the kernel itself. The device class identifier's primary function is to create device identifiers, which are used to identify known devices in the device database in the runtime kernel. This is done by hashing device descriptors and access requests into a SHA-1 digest. When a USB device is inserted, approved device access is committed to the device database. Disapproved requests are effectively ignored by the kernel, while the user daemon invokes the honeypot virtual machine for analysis. The human interface driver provides significant access to system resources and functions. If used maliciously, this driver can be a dangerous security hole. As discussed, the HID driver can be disabled for a device the user denies access to. This is important. However, some USB devices have a legitimate need for access to a portion of the driver's functionality. This is where good USB's limited human device driver interface comes in. In the case of a USB headset, for example, access is restricted to the volume up, down, and mute commands. The limited HID device driver is experimental at this point in time as it supports only the USB headset use case. To profile suspicious USB devices, good USB implements a honeypot virtual machine called Honey USB. The Honey VM runs Ubuntu Linux and reserves a USB controller device on the host machine. On the VM, USBmon is enabled and a custom application called USB Pro aggregates device information. Information is collected from numerous subsystems including sysfs, lsusb, USB devices, and TCP dump. In addition, a customized version of GVFS, the Android GIO file virtual system driver, captures disk read-write operations. The good USB honeypot offers numerous advantages. The honeypot virtual machine emulates a host, not a device, so potentially malicious devices never access resources on the host. Honey USB can also generate an exhaustive description of actions taken by the device while in use. As reported in this paper, good USB was tested against 4 types of attacks: human interface device attacks, USB serial device attacks, composite device attacks, and smartphone USB attacks. We will examine the results of these attacks next. To test the human interface device driver attack, the authors used Rubber Ducky, a penetration test tool, in a configuration that attempts to register a USB storage device and open an Xterm window to issue multiple commands. Upon insertion of the attack device, good USB intercepts the device and raises its access requests to the user. When the user flags it as a USB storage device only, good USB rejects the request for the human interface device driver. This foils the attack by the new device. Note that the USB storage device portion of the Rubber Duck device continues to work as expected. Later, when the Rubber Duck device is inserted again, the user rejects the device, which directs it to the honeypot VM. The honeypot log shows some very interesting commands, including an attempt to cat the etc/password file. To test the serial device driver attack, the authors used Teensy, a USB simulation tool, in a configuration that attempts to register a USB storage device and open a TTY connection to issue multiple commands. The idea here is that there is a host-based Trojan already installed that is listening for commands on the serial port. As before, upon insertion of the attack device, good USB intercepts the device and raises its access request to the user. When the user flags it as a USB storage device only, good USB rejects the request for the serial device driver, and this foils the attack by the new device. To test a composite device, the authors use Teensy again, this time in a configuration that attempts to register 4 drivers: a keyboard driver, joystick driver, a mouse driver, and a serial port driver. When operated in advanced mode, good USB allows the user to selectively pick and choose which of these drivers to grant the device access to. This allows the user to grant the devices the exact amount of privilege he or she deems appropriate. Using a rooted Android phone with USB tethering access, it's possible to create a man-in-the-middle attack scenario by presenting the phone as an Ethernet device. On initial connection, the Android phone requests USB cell phone access. This results in a USB storage device request which is appropriate and granted by the user. Then, USB tethering is enabled on the phone. This creates a second device driver request that is handled by Good USB. If the user correctly chooses USB cell phone as the device class again, the attack is thwarted. A second way the attack can be mitigated is by the user flagging the device as potentially malicious. This routes the device to the honeypot virtual machine and records the IP traffic generated by the phone. Importantly, Good USB does not significantly slow down the host machine. Device identification has negligible overhead, while device enumeration adds 5.2% overhead on first enumeration and 5.0% thereafter. As one would expect, use of the honeypot virtual machine adds more significant costs. Starting the VM from a cold start takes between 5 and 10 seconds, while additional redirects to the honeypot take approximately a quarter of a second. Interestingly, there are notable variances between devices. Enumeration of a thumb drive adds the aforementioned 5.1% overhead, while an Android phone is slower, adding 7.3% overhead, and a USB headset is slower still because it requires multiple device drivers. There is no impact on regular device operations, however, once enumeration is complete. As you might imagine, software like Good USB raises many questions, starting with, why is Good USB needed at all? Let's discuss each of these questions in turn, starting with that one. As we've discussed, the USB protocol on most hosts is too naive to defend against firmware-based threats. Simply put, the USB stack is too trusting, invented as it was prior to these modern attack vectors. Even if a USB whitelisting strategy is employed, there is no guarantee that a malicious device will not delay its attack until a subsequent time once it has been accepted by the system. One possible defense against firmware-level attacks is restricting USB device use to reputable vendors providing signed, guaranteed firmware. However, such devices are both rare and expensive. Moreover, even signed firmware can be co-opted at certain stages of its creation. Does selectively disabling interfaces break USB devices? A number of devices were tested, including USB keyboards, mice, flash drives, headsets, wireless adapters, webcams, smartphones, and chargers. While the author's study was not conclusive or scientific, they report that compatibility of the devices tested was good. Significantly, devices that requested multiple drivers were able to function when one or more of the requested accesses was denied. Still, some compatibility should be expected when using Good USB. Notably, devices such as the YubiKey authentication device, which is both a USB smart card and human interface device, may present challenges. In these cases, Good USB should be able to accommodate new device-to-interface mappings to allow the device to function properly. Can Good USB authenticate individual USB device units? Good USB is not an authentication framework. Because USB devices can lie about their identity, device authentication is a dubious proposition. Good USB seeks to identify classes of devices rather than attempting to identify a particular device with guaranteed precision. The goal is to determine what types of access a device should have, not to identify any given device. Can Good USB protect against malicious smartphones? Smartphones cannot be managed as easily as discrete USB devices because they request vendor-specific interfaces when connected to a host. This keeps Good USB from being able to assess a smartphone's potential access until it is too late. However, Honey USB can provide valuable information about the smartphone's activity. Plugging a smartphone into Honey USB using pass-through provides valuable information about what the smartphone is doing, including what drivers it is loading. Can Good USB be used as an intrusion detection system? Currently, users themselves determine which device access requests are appropriate and which are abnormal. Future versions of Good USB could automate policy violation detection by assisting users in making decisions about potentially malicious behavior. As discussed, the USB Pro application aggregates device activity logs. This information could be used to learn normal device behaviors. Machine learning techniques could also help detect abnormal behaviors when a new device is enumerated. Is Good USB easily deployable? The short answer is no. Good USB relies on instrumentation of the kernel, which in turn requires a custom kernel be built and deployed. The authors propose to release pre-built Good USB kernels for certain Linux distros. It remains to be seen whether this is sustainable. Distribution of the USB honeypot virtual machine is much more straightforward. Pre-configured KVM images will be provided. Good USB is not an end-state product. In the future, the authors intend to perform driver analysis that explores the problem of limiting a device's access to only the specific elements it requires. In particular, the Honey USB subsystem offers areas for improvement. One improvement is that Honey USB could be enhanced to inform the approved device-to-driver interface mappings used by the Good USB policy engine. Another improvement is that Honey USB could provide device profile information that would improve Good USB's smartphone vendor-specific interface handling, allowing these devices to be managed similarly to simpler USB devices. As documented in the paper, there is much related work in the field of USB security. USB fuzzers have been proposed that would harden specific USB device drivers against software-based attacks. This would be insufficient to stop firmware-based attacks, however. Other trust management schemes have been proposed that mediate the use of USB storage devices in industrial control systems. While these consider firmware-based attacks, they were unable to prevent escalated device interface requests. Secure USB devices such as IronKey can prevent attacks by using signed firmware. However, few such devices are in actual common use. Moreover, there is no guarantee that the device manufacturer can and will protect their signing keys. Ghost USB Honeypot implements the opposite strategy of USB Honeypot by acting as a USB storage device malware detection on a host. While useful, this does not allow Ghost to detect or prevent firmware-based attacks. Multiple device fingerprint detection schemes have been proposed, including with 802.11 devices, Ethernet cards, and RFID cards using various electronic signature analysis techniques. It is unclear whether these approaches could be applied to USB devices. Power analyses are unlikely to be effective with USB devices because they are powered by the host. More importantly, such analyses depend on a static signature, while malicious USB devices may actively seek to avoid detection by altering their signature. Pass phases and story are image recognition-based authentication systems. Recent banking surveys have pointed out that these are of limited value. In the best case, security image strategies may help support users who have undergone targeted training with imaging systems. In conclusion, USB attacks are becoming more sophisticated, and bad USB attacks have been postulated in USB device firmware. Currently, there is no generally available defense against firmware attacks. These attacks target unconstrained privileges of USB drivers, particularly human interface drivers, which provide a simple attack vector for script-based attacks. Good USB analyzes USB device driver requests, classifies them, and allows users to approve device permissions at insertion, record approved devices and tag them with the security image, and reject a device and direct it to a honeypot virtual machine for analysis. Good USB is a highly performant addition to the Linux kernel and adds only 5.2% performance overhead. While Good USB currently requires a custom kernel build, it is possible that future Linux kernels could implement Good USB directly in the general purpose build. The code for Good USB is publicly available at www.florida-security.org.